Check, check. The bright side of addiction is recovery, and recovery is an American way of life. If you are in recovery or know or love someone who is, or maybe you just want to know a little bit more about the recovery process, maybe you're concerned about someone you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you. As we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery, and a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured an historic interview that I did many years ago with Betty Ford, actor John Larroquette, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, musician Bonnie Raitt, authors Brene Brown, Anne Lamott, JA Jance, who will be joining us in this edition, former NFL player Ryan Leaf, and Thomas Hollywood Henderson. All these interviews and more are on our website, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their story and their insight and their path. Welcome to Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. In this podcast, we're going to catch up with our dear friend, best-selling author JA Jance, who has published 66 best-selling novels following years of an alcoholic marriage. In fact, her first character was a Seattle policeman who was deep into his alcoholism. A reader pointed that out, and Judy made a course correction: recovery. Here's a quick clip from today's podcast.
The Beaumont books are written in the first person. I happen to know a lot about drinking, so I had him do the kind of drinking I had lived with for all those years. I had written 4 books and was working on the 5th one when I went to a signing in Portland, and a lady came up to the table and she said, Beaumont drinks every day. He has a drink of choice. It's starting to interfere with his work. Does JP Beaumont have a problem? 6 other people asked me the same question. And that's when I realized I had modeled that character after a problem drinker, and I had painted his portrait so accurately that my readers figured out he had a problem long before I did. He had his first blackout in book number 7. He was in treatment in book number 8. I just finished writing Beaumont number 26. So he's been in recovery a lot longer than he was drinking.
My conversation with the great J.A. Jance is coming right up. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast. With a big virtual hug to everyone who is listening, and a very sincere thank you for listening to our podcast. Your time's valuable. I know that. I respect that. And I so appreciate you spending a little time with us on the podcast. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org. Following 17 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities. They offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy it and to please do us a favor, share it with your friends as well. Recovery is an American way of life. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We'd love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast, supported by our good friends at Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and, the most important part, most successful treatment programs. Sundown M Ranch continues to be one of the preeminent treatment programs in the country, known for their amazing and compassionate staff, their method of treatment, and their low cost of treatment. Now, they are a non-profit organization, a not-for-profit treatment center. Their bottom line is recovery. Now, they own their own land in Washington State, not far from Seattle, at the mouth of the Yakima River Canyon. Now, in addition to their outstanding inpatient treatment program, they also have an award-winning adolescent program that utilizes a trained team of certified counselors and medical professionals who are fully committed to the highest quality of highly specific adolescent treatment at the most affordable price. The adolescent program, by the way, gender specific, each person supported by a team of top notch professionals that includes medical, educational, psychological, even recreation specialists. Living arrangements, gender specific as well. Separate wings for males and females. Patient rooms, they have an outside view, they have twin beds, nice rooms, full bath, shower. You can take a look see at sundown.org/gallery. They accept most major insurance plans, and if need be, they can arrange for financing. Their main goal is recovery. Their motto is the patient is the reason we are here, and it is proven out over the 55 years that they have been guiding individuals and families into long term recovery. Some 200,000 individuals have gone through Sundown, and if you want what they have, and you or someone you know has a problem with alcohol or any other drug, contact the Compassionate Recovery Team at Sundown. Sundown.org, it's where recovery begins. Time again for another cup of coffee, and it's time to sit down and have that cup of coffee or whatever your favorite beverage happens to be, and listen in on my conversation with JA Jance about her new book and her life with a practicing alcoholic and how that experience shaped her life, shaped her success. Let's listen. We have today a guest that's been on the show many, many times. It's a woman that I absolutely adore. I love her writing. I love her family. I love her everything about Judy Jance. J.A. Jance is one of the most prolific writers, I think, in all of mystery writing. And many of our listeners will be familiar with, of course, J.P. Beaumont. And when I first started reading about J.P. Beaumont, he was still in the throes of his alcoholism. He went into recovery, and there's been a number of books about JP. And then Joanna Brady and Allie Reynolds and the Walker family. And J.A. Jance has a brand new book out, and it's absolutely fabulous. It's called Blessings of the Lost Girls, and there's a lot to talk about with that. J.A. Jance joining us, and Judy, welcome back to Recovery Coast to Coast.
I'm really happy to be here, and you'll be glad to know that Blessing is my 66th published novel.
66th?
Yes,
My
66. I started writing my first novel in March of 1983, and this is number 66 and 67. The next Beaumont book is already written and in New York, so that's Den of Iniquity. But we're talking about Blessing today.
Oh, my goodness. Tell me about Blessings and how that came to be. And that, of course, is a Walker family novel. And it also includes Joanna Brady. And, of course, Rosa Rios is a woman who was in the throes of her alcoholism, and she sobered up.
Well, I think that's the case with many of the missing and murdered Indigenous girls. They get fouled up on alcohol, they don't make good decisions, and they end up in bad places at bad times. The fact that she's clean and sober when she's murdered is really a tragedy. I was writing a previous book, the most recent Allie book, Collateral Damage. I had a phone call from someone who told me about a recent phone call she'd had. In the 90s, there was a real serial killer, the so-called boxcar killer, who rode around the country on freight trains pushing Native Americans under moving trains. In the mid-90s, he is now serving life without parole on 5 counts of homicide. In the 90s, he visited a small city in Central Oregon where he pushed a Lakota named James under a moving train. The engineer took a mile and a half before he could stop the train. Law enforcement was called to the scene, and James, who had been dragged for that mile and a half, was pronounced dead and zipped into a body bag. He was taken to the town morgue, which was in the basement of the community hospital. Later that day, a nurse who worked in the hospital and who happened to know James, because she was also Lakota, went down to the morgue after she got off shift to wash his hair. And when she unzipped the body bag, his arm came out because he wasn't dead. He went from the morgue to the OR for the first of countless operations it took to him back together. He emerged as a paraplegic. He lost the use of his dominant hand. He had to learn to speak again. He had to learn to read again. And in the process of his many hospitalizations, he encountered a friend and fan of mine who went to his hospital room and read books to him. And because she loved my books, she read my books to him. And because her kids are half Anglo, half Lakota, she read the Walker books to him. He recovered enough that he spent the next 20 years counseling disaffected Native American urban youth in the Portland area. But shortly before his death in 2021, he called my friend and said, "Tell your friend to write more Walker books. There aren't enough Indian heroes." And that was the inspiration for this book. When you meet John Walker, the wheelchair-bound medicine man in Blessing of the Girls, you'll know that James told me there weren't enough Indian heroes, and now he is one.
Boy, he sure is. And the Walker family series, of course, began, I believe, back in 1990 or 91 with Hour of the Hunter, and then Kiss of the Bees, and Day of the Dead, and Queen of the Night, and then, Dance of the Bones, and now we get to Blessings of the Lost Girls. And I assume by what you're saying, Judy, is that there will be more Walker books.
Well, New York has always been sort of reluctant about the Walkers, which is why there are 6 of them now. But I think Blessing is going to cure them of their reluctance. I spent 5 years as a K-12 librarian on the reservation. The stories and legends I learned as a storyteller are woven into the background of these books. And I respect the Tohono O'odham people, and I believe I've done my best to treat them fairly in the Walker books. They paint a real portrait of their way of life and their belief system and who they are. That's my hope. Because when I went to the reservation, knowing nothing about the Tohono O'odham people, I found them to be kind, trustworthy, and pretty much wonderful.
How long did it take you to write this last book?
Well, that makes me laugh because the last Allie Reynolds book, Collateral Damage, I started writing my first Beaumont novel in March of 1983. And if I've written 67 books now, generally speaking, writing a book takes 6 months from beginning to end. Then I ran into Collateral Damage, the most recent Allie book. That book took a whole year, and as I agonized my way through it, I thought, I'll never write another book. This is the last book I'll ever write. I've completely lost my mojo. And then when I sat down to write Blessing, I wrote that book beginning to end in 2 months flat.
That's amazing. That's a record for you, I assume. That's the fastest you've ever written a book.
That is a record for me. But the story just flowed out in a way that was wonderful to do, but also wonderful to observe because I count the words every day, and every day that word count just kept going up. The other thing that's interesting about this book is it's a crossover because, yes, it's a Walker book with Brandon Walker's son-in-law, Dan Pardee, front and center, but it's also a Joanna Brady book because that initial victim that we meet, Rosa Rios, is a former barrel racer. And in a previous Joanna Brady book, Jenny, who was in junior rodeo then, actually participated in a barrel race against Rosa and actually lost. So this is a serial killer who targets barrel racers. And so Jenny is drawn into this investigation as well. She spent her life thinking she wanted to be a veterinarian. But in the last Joanna Brady book, she changed her mind and switched over to criminal justice. So it's wonderful to see this girl who started out in the Joanna Brady books as a 9-year-old grow into this capable and wonderful young woman.
It is delightful to see her and having seen her grow up in your books. As you write the books, the characters, of course, age. And Jenny, now being a criminal justice major, is instrumental in this book.
I think that's one of the reasons why my readers regard my characters as real people, because they have aged and changed over the years, all of them. And we all do. It's inevitable. The Beaumont who was a divorced homicide cop in the first Beaumont book, is now a happily married, retired homicide cop, but he is still involved.
It's been a long journey, and your journey as well has been long and circuitous. And it began when you were married to a man who was a practicing alcoholic. Can you give us a little background on that for some of the listeners now who may not be familiar with Judy Jance?
Well, when I brought my first boyfriend home to beat my parents, they said, he's a raging alcoholic. And I said, oh, what do you know? You're just teetotalers. And then I spent the next 18 years of my life trying to prove them wrong and also trying to fix him, which was absolutely the wrong thing to do. While we were on the reservation, we lived 30 miles from town in either direction, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and or telephone. And on those long evenings when he'd be passed out as soon as dinner was over, I sat there writing poetry. He was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to me, and he told me after we married, there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it. So I wasn't supposed to be writing, so I never showed him the poetry because that was against his wishes. So I would write these poems and stick them into the strongbox. I knew that was a place he would never look. But it turns out I never looked there either, not until after he died of chronic alcoholism at age 42 on New Year's Eve of 1982. In 83, then, in March, I had to go looking in the strongbox. And when I saw the poetry, I was gobsmacked because it was like seeing my life in instant replay, but it was also shocking to me to see how early in the relationship, the creative part of me understood the relationship was doomed, but I didn't actually come to terms with it until another 11 or 12 years later when I finally got a divorce. And I think one of the most telling poems, what happens to people who are involved in addictive relationships, the person who isn't doing the drug of choice, that person eventually is completely nuts. And one of the poems, Breakage, I wrote in April, shortly before I got the divorce. I came home from church and couldn't get into the house because he had covered the doorknob with olive oil in order to drive the evil spirits out of the house. So I sent him to bed. I told him to go take a nap. And then I went through the house and I gathered up all his bottles, the ones that were hidden in flushing tanks, the ones that were here, the ones that were there. And I wrote the following poem. The bottle shattered as it hit the wall. I stood with arm upraised and knew that I had smashed it. It could as easily have been his head. The anger raged around me like a roaring flood, and I wanted victims, and it wasn't hard to flush them from their hidden lairs. I broke the bottles one by one with cool deliberation. By the very act of breaking them, I certified their victory. I took him to the doctor then, not because he needed it. I did. Because that day it was dangerous for him to be in the house when I was that completely nuts.
You wrote a book of poetry called After the Fire, which is still probably my favorite book. And I know we've had this conversation before, and you said you don't write poetry anymore. But Judy, this is torn and tattered and worn out, but it sits by my bedside. After the Fire.
I wrote the book. I wrote the poem as a way of dealing with the problem. When the book was published, I thought it might help other people. 2 weeks ago, at a book signing in Phoenix, a woman in the front row said, "After the Fire saved my life. Everything that went on inside the walls of our house was a secret. And then I read After the Fire, and I realized I didn't have to keep those secrets anymore."
You must get that a lot from readers.
I do, and it's really touching when I hear how After the Fire has made a difference in someone's life. And that's why I always talk about After the Fire at book signings, because statistically, I know that in any given audience, there's at least one person who is dealing with that situation, either personally or seeing what it's doing to a child or a friend or a loved one. And so I always talk about After the Fire because of all my books, I think it's the most important. And not just because it was doing a poetry reading of that book in 1985, where I met my second husband, the good one.
The good one. Bill the good one.
Bill is definitely the good one. Actually, he was the one who gave me the title for this Walker book. I had struggled for 3 nights, tossing and turning, trying to come up with a name. And when I finally put him on the job, he thought about it for all of a minute and a half. He came up with Blessing of the Lost Girls on a Monday night. I started writing the book on Tuesday morning, and 2 months later, it was done.
That's absolutely incredible. What did you learn looking back from all of the time you spent in that alcoholic marriage and then finally getting out of it?
What I learned was he went into treatment 9 times. But he only went into treatment because I was in crisis. He never went into treatment because he thought he needed it. And even hospitalized with no liver or kidney function, he was sure he was going to get a liver transplant, which, of course, he didn't. What I learned was that I really did set out to fix him. That was my goal. I wanted to make him better. And that wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to me. I should have just left him to be his own self and left me to be my own self. And I think a lot of people who remain stuck in those relationships think that one day they're going to find the magic wand that is going to provide all the answers. And the magic wand just isn't out there. Unless that person wants to help themselves, nothing is going to work.
Talk a little bit about JP Beaumont. When you started writing, Bo, he was an alcoholic. And tell the story again, if you would, about the person who came to you at a book signing and pointed out that he might be having a problem with alcohol.
When I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program at the University of Arizona. So nobody told me that you need to write what you know, but I'm sort of smart enough to figure that out on my own. The Beaumont books are written in the first person, and he couldn't be at work all the time. He had to do something when he wasn't working. Well, I happen to know a lot about drinking, so I had him do the kind of drinking I had lived with for all those years. So I had written 4 books and was working on the 5th one when I went to a signing in Portland, and a lady came up to the table and she said, Beaumont drinks every day. He has a drink of choice. It's starting to interfere with his work. Does JP Beaumont have a problem? And I looked down at my books on the table, and I looked up at her and I said, these are books. But at that set of signings, 6 other people asked me the same question. And that's when I realized I had modeled that character after a problem drinker, and I had painted his portrait so accurately that my readers figured out he had a problem long before I did.
And he got help for his problem.
He got help. He had his first blackout in book number 7. He was in treatment in book number 8. I just finished writing Beaumont number 26. So he's been in recovery a lot longer than he was drinking. However, I still have people who tell me they liked him better when he was drunk. I worry about those people, but there's nothing I can do about them.
Yeah, that's a sign right there, I guess. Well, it's good to know that there's going to be another JP Beaumont coming out.
The title of that one is Den of Iniquity. Starts out on Valentine's Day when JP Beaumont and his wife Mel get an unexpected surprise when Beau's 18-year-old grandson runs away from home because his parents are getting a divorce and his father has moved his pregnant, much younger girlfriend into the house. Kyle wants to come live with Mel and Beau, and how they deal with that family crisis is really interesting to watch.
And there is a little preview of the next JP Beaumont, but we're talking today about Blessings of the Lost Girls. It's a great book. It just came out. What else can you tell us about this book? Maybe some of the surprises in writing it.
In the book, I create a character based on James, the Lakota, who was dragged for 1.5 miles by a moving train. I moved him away from Central Oregon, but he's in a wheelchair. He's a paraplegic. He's counseling disaffected youth. And one of my fans wrote to me and said, only you could get away with taking a guy named John Wheeler, sticking him in a wheelchair as a paraplegic, and then call him chairman. without it seeming derogatory. Chairman is my tribute to James, and this book is actually dedicated to James.
In the book, you talk about the chairman running a group called The Circle. Where does that come from? Is there a group called The Circle?
No, that is entirely fictitious. But in Native American culture, circles are very important. And circles are important to me. So last year, my first husband and I lived on the reservation, taught on the reservation. We were invited to the wine dance. The wine dance happens in August. The beverage in question is made from the fruit on the top of the saguaros. They knock down the fruit with the ribs of dead saguaros. Then they gather it in baskets. They take it home. They boil it. They mash it. They ferment it. And what comes out is a beverage, the color and consistency of tomato juice with a wallop of tequila. And so at the wine dance, which happens in August, everyone sits in a circle around a bonfire. Yes, it's August. In the cities in August in Arizona, the temperatures don't go down because there's so much concrete and asphalt that retains the heat. But out in the dirt desert, once the sun goes down, it gets icy cold. So everybody sits in a circle. The wine is poured into a cup and it's passed from hand to hand around the circle. And this goes on all night long until everyone seated in the circle is so drunk that they barf into the dirt. Well, our Anglo sensibilities are offended by that. But in actual fact, it's taking the fruit from the top of the saguaro and returning it to the earth, thus closing the circle. Our whole family was invited to the wine dance. We had a baby. I stayed home with the baby. My husband went to the wine dance. And until the day he died, he rubbed my nose in the fact that he got to sit in the circle and I did not. After the fourth Walker book, I was invited to come out to the reservation and do an event at the Tribal Museum. And I was very nervous about this because I thought I had handled the desert people honorably in my books. I thought I had treated their beliefs and lifestyle with respect, but I didn't know how they felt about me. So Bill and I drove out there on a cold, blustery March morning. It was dusty, it was windy, and I was very nervous. Well, we pulled into the parking lot, and it was full of cars from out of state, from Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Idaho, because all of my Arizona snowbirds had read about the event on my website, and they all drove 140 miles round trip to see what it was all about. So the event started, and the MC called on the medicine man to do the invocation. By the way, medicine men are very long-winded. The invocation was done in Tohono O'odham. I know a lot of O'odham words, but I am certainly not fluent. However, I know he was talking about me because every once in a while he would use the word librarian. Evidently, there is no word for library in Tohono O'odham. So finally, the invocation ended, and the MC said, "Okay, we're now going to have a group of young people come out and do a circle dance. Please do not take any photos while they're doing the circle dance because this is a sacred dance. But when we open it to social dancing, you're welcome to take photos then, and you're welcome to come down and join the circle." So the whole time I was watching those young people doing the circle dance, I was thinking about my first husband sitting in the circle and rubbing my nose in the fact that I hadn't. And I thought, Judy, isn't it about time you put your money where your mouth is? You've been pissed about this for 40 years. How about if you do something about it? When they opened it for social dancing, and I stood up to go down and join the circle, the people gave me a standing ovation. And you can't see this, but having told you that, I now have goosebumps on my legs because that moment was what I thought was the high point of my career. I had written the Walker book in hopes of bringing reservation life alive to people who would never go there. And I was thinking, okay, my life will never be better than this. And then all those Milligan ladies, those Anglo ladies from all those out-of-state cars, they came down and they danced in the circle as well. And that was and remains the high point of my literary career. Yes, the University of Arizona gave me an honorary doctorate in 2000, but that moment doesn't compare with dancing in that circle.
That is stunningly beautiful. I've got goosebumps just listening to that story. And you can find all about the Walker family in the new book, Blessings of the Lost
Thank you.
Girls. And you know the fact that Indigenous women are disappearing, whether it's alcohol related or not, is such a huge problem in our country.
Well, the real point about After the Fire is it wasn't until after I divorced my first husband that I began writing novels. In terms of being husband material, my husband was a dead loss. From the point of view of somebody who wanted to write murder mysteries, the guy was a gold mine. So it all evens out.
We've talked about JP Beaumont and, of course, Joanna Brady and the Walker family. Give us an update on Allie Reynolds, if you would.
I think Allie Reynolds and I have the most in common. In the first book, Edge of Evil, her life, her marriage, and her career both blow up at the same time. And she goes from LA back home to Sedona, Arizona, and sort of reinvents herself. And now she is the CFO of her husband's global IT security company. I relate to that because after I divorced my husband, I had to reinvent myself too. And that's what I want to say to people in After the Fire. You think your life is always going to be this awful, murky mess. And then one day you can actually walk into the sunshine. And that's what I did. And that's what Allie Reynolds has done too. So I feel a real kinship to Allie.
Will there be another Allie coming in the next year?
There better be. That's what I need to write next. I don't have a title. I don't have a plot, but I'm thinking about one.
I assume all of your books are available, and certainly in print form, also on Kindle.
I am. When I started out, I was told that original paperback mysteries have a shelf life of 90 days.
Oh.
I'm happy to tell you that I signed a print copy of Until Proven Guilty, 2 of them actually, at the book signing I did last night in Bremerton. So yes, they're available in audio form, they're available in print form, and they're also available as ebooks.
I know they are available in audio form because I'd like to tell our listeners that you did a very beautiful thing for me. A number of years ago, my partner Kitty was dying of glioblastoma, brain cancer. We met with you in an interview we did in the studio, and you were kind enough to give her copies on audio cassette of your books, which brought her immense joy. And you invited us over to your home to spend some time in your meditation garden. And it's something that meant so much to her and so much to me, and I just can't
welcome.
Thank you enough.
It was a pleasure. Well, thank you much.
Judy, thank you so very, very much, and I look forward to talking to you again in the not-too-distant future about the new Beaumont. Thanks, Judy.
Okay.
I hope you've enjoyed my chat with JA Jance, one of the most prolific mystery writers in America, author of 66 New York Times bestsellers. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast, if you'd like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, and as long as you have been in continuous recovery a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, actor Lou Gossett Jr. is going to share some personal thoughts on truth and trust. We'll do that in 30 seconds.
We wasted a lot of years hoping, praying for things to get better. I was desperate to save our family. That's when I made the contact.
She contacted Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized alcohol and drug treatment program teaches family members how to break down the barriers of denial. They are taught the skills needed to deal with addiction as a family.
Now we're making up for lost time. It was the best contact I ever made.
Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, here is actor Lou Gossett Jr., who shares his thoughts on truth and trust.
Broken promises, denial, excuses, exaggerations, lies upon lies upon lies. That's how many of us grew up. In our household, fiction rather than fact was the norm. We wouldn't have recognized truth if it stared us in the eye. Our parents lied to each other and for each other. It seemed that they preferred lies to truths, and we followed right along. The whole family lied to hide or sidestep drunkenness, violence, irresponsibility, or other unpleasant realities. We as youngsters lied to get attention, to avoid punishment, to survive. If we didn't grow out of these ingrained habit patterns, we paid a heavy price as adults. Because our lies became even more widespread, it was impossible to keep track of them. We feared getting caught, and often it was unavoidable. People stopped trusting and respecting us. Worse, we no longer trusted or respected ourselves. Needless to say, it's exceedingly difficult to break these lifelong habits. We feel naked and vulnerable without our armor of deceit. Yet we want to move forward, and we know that our ability to function in the world will be severely limited if we don't take actions to become honest and above board in all our affairs. Thought for today? There were times when it seemed that dishonesty made life simpler. I've since learned that nothing is more simple than the truth.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, do me a favor, would you please share it with 2 other people? You can find all of our podcasts, by the way, at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch, again, our email, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Remember, if you know someone experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here is that 24-hour national helpline that I like to tell you about, offering free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals available as well. 1-800-622-4357, which is HELP. We encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. It's a relatively new website designed for individuals, families, and friends, including information on how to pay for treatment, including where to find low-cost and free treatment options. You'll also find healthcare support and find out how to help someone else who's having a problem, or find help for yourself. It's all in one place, findsupport.gov. Join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.